A bicyclist riding along a paved path in Waukesha, Wisconsin, noticed something moving in the dirt. A 12-year-old girl was dragging herself out of the tree line. She was covered in blood, 19 stab wounds mapped across her small frame. One had missed her heart by a fraction of a millimeter. The sheer brutality of the scene defied logic, but the true horror lay in the identity of the attackers. The people who left her to die were her two 12-year-old best friends, and they committed this atrocity as a blood sacrifice to a digital ghost. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Waukesha, Wisconsin, sits roughly 18 miles west of Milwaukee. It is a city of 70,000 residents, defined by quiet subdivisions, predictable routines, and a heavy reliance on community trust. During the bitter Midwestern winters, temperatures routinely drop below 0 Fahrenheit, keeping families indoors, isolated behind closed doors and glowing screens. It is the type of environment where middle schoolers walk home unsupervised, and parents rarely question what their children are doing on their tablets when the house goes quiet. Born in 2002, Morgan Geyser occupied one of these unassuming homes. From the outside, she appeared to be an intelligent, if slightly eccentric, 6th grader. She maintained decent grades and stayed out of trouble. But beneath the facade of a typical preteen lay a rapidly deteriorating psychological landscape. Morgan was experiencing the onset of childhood schizophrenia, an incredibly rare and severe condition for someone her age. Her cognitive framework was fracturing. She exhibited a distinctly flat affect, meaning her face and voice rarely registered normal emotional responses. While other children learned empathy through socialization, Morgan remained detached, observing human interaction as if studying a foreign language. Her parents noted her quirks, a morbid fascination with the macabre, strange, and violent doodles in the margins of her notebooks, but they rationalized them. Middle school is an awkward phase, and introverted kids often explore dark themes. There was a family history of mental illness, yet the specific, terrifying signs of Morgan's detachment from reality were completely missed. She did not just have an active imagination, she was actively losing the ability to distinguish between the physical world and the dark corners of her own mind. A few streets over, Anissa Weier was fighting a very different kind of battle. Also born in 2002, Anissa was consumed by a profound, agonizing insecurity. She felt entirely disconnected from her peers at Horning Middle School, navigating the brutal social hierarchy as a perpetual outcast. Anissa was lonely, awkward, and carried an overwhelming desperation for acceptance. She lacked a core sense of identity. To cope with her isolation, she retreated into the digital world, spending hours alone in her bedroom scrolling through internet forums and obscure websites, searching for a place to fit in. Anissa was a quintessential follower. When a young person is starving for a sense of belonging, they become highly malleable, willing to adopt the beliefs and behaviors of anyone who offers them validation. She needed someone to tell her she mattered. She needed an anchor, even if that anchor was slowly sinking. Before they found each other, Morgan and Anissa were isolated entities. Morgan possessed a commanding, delusional force, a mind constructing intricate, dark realities that demanded validation. Anissa was a blank slate, eagerly searching for a stronger personality to latch onto and a narrative to make her life feel significant. They were two girls standing on the precipice of puberty, each harboring distinct psychological vulnerabilities. The danger did not lie in their individual issues, but in the exact way their pathologies would soon intertwine. Morgan required a believer to make her delusions feel real. Anissa required a leader to give her a sense of purpose. Together, they would form a closed feedback loop, a catastrophic psychological synergy that would eventually demand a physical toll. Their convergence happened on a mundane middle school bus ride in late 2013. Anissa, desperate for a connection, sat next to Morgan. The dynamic established itself almost instantly. Anissa recognized a peer who was even further outside the social norms than she was, while Morgan found a willing audience for her increasingly bizarre thoughts. They were not friends in the traditional sense. Their relationship was an echo chamber, a hermetically sealed psychological ecosystem where their worst traits fed off one another. Anissa provided unwavering loyalty. Morgan provided an alternate reality where they were special. The catalyst for their descent was a household tablet and an unrestricted internet connection. In December of that year, the girls discovered the Creepypasta Wiki. It was an online repository for user-generated horror stories, a digital campfire where anonymous authors posted urban legends designed to terrify. Most adolescents browsed these sites for a quick thrill before moving on with their day. But Morgan and Anissa did not move on. They anchored themselves to one specific mythos, the Slender Man. He was described across various forums as an unnaturally tall, unnervingly thin figure, lacking a face, dressed in a sharp black suit, with tendrils protruding from his back. The lore dictated that he lived deep in the woods, possessed telepathic abilities, and preyed on children. For a healthy preteen, he was a ghost story. For Morgan, whose unmedicated schizophrenia was rapidly warping her perception, the Slender Man was a diagnosis. He was the explanation for the shadows she saw shifting in her bedroom corners and the auditory hallucinations whispering in her ears. She confided in her new friend that the faceless entity was watching her, tracking her every move. She claimed he could read her mind and teleport at will. At this critical juncture, Anissa faced a choice. She could dismiss the claims as crazy, tell an adult, and risk losing the only peer who accepted her, or she could believe. Desperate to maintain the bond, Anissa chose the latter. This decision birthed the textbook case of folie à deux, a shared psychotic disorder. Anissa's validation acted as the concrete pouring over Morgan's delusions, hardening them into absolute, undeniable truth. They were no longer two unpopular girls in a Midwestern school. They were initiates into a dark, secret world. The online mythology had specific rules. To spare your own family from the Slender Man's wrath and to elevate yourself to the status of his chosen servant, you had to become a proxy. Proxies were humans who carried out the entity's violent will, earning the right to live with him in his mansion. The girls convinced themselves this mansion was located deep in the Nicollet National Forest, a sprawling wilderness roughly 300 miles north of their hometown. Becoming a proxy required a demonstration of absolute loyalty. It required a blood sacrifice they needed to kill. This dark calculus necessitated a victim. Enter Payton Leutner. Payton was the exact opposite of Anissa. She was bright, grounded, and possessed a strong moral compass. She had been Morgan's best friend since the 4th grade. When Morgan struggled to fit in, Payton was the one who sat with her, defending her eccentricities out of a deep, genuine sense of empathy. Payton anchored Morgan to the real world. She was a lifeline to normalcy. But when Anissa entered the picture, the triad became deeply unstable. Anissa harbored a sharp, quiet jealousy toward Payton. She resented the history the two other girls shared and viewed Payton as an obstacle to her exclusive ownership of Morgan. More importantly, Payton's intrinsic goodness and rationality were a direct threat to the dark fantasy world Morgan and Anissa were actively constructing. To permanently migrate into the Slender Man's reality, the tether to the real world had to be cut. Payton was selected not out of a blinding, impulsive rage, but through cold, calculated necessity. She was the sacrifice. She was accessible, trusting, and totally unaware of the venom brewing just beneath the surface of their sleepovers. From that moment, the fantasy transitioned into a logistical operation. Over the next 5 months, the two girls whispered on the school bus, passing notebooks filled with encoded plans and crude drawings of their faceless master. They debated methodologies with the casual detachment of students planning a science fair project. They discussed whether to carry out the act in a local park or to strike while the victim slept. They meticulously prepared supply lists, detailing what they would need for their 300-mile trek into the northern forests after the deed was done. The adults around them saw two girls whispering and giggling over a shared secret, assuming it was harmless chatter. They had no idea that behind those notebooks, Morgan and Anissa were finalizing the blueprints for an execution. May 30th, 2014 began as a celebration. It was Morgan's 12th birthday, marked by a Friday night excursion to Skateland, a local roller rink in Waukesha. To any chaperone or passing parent, the scene was entirely innocuous. 3 preteen girls, laughing, gliding across the scuffed wooden floor, beneath flashing neon lights. Payton was happy to celebrate her friend. She remained completely oblivious to the fact that her execution had been scheduled for that very night. The original blueprint, meticulously drafted in Morgan's private notebooks, called for a 2 a.m. assassination. After returning from the roller rink, the trio settled into Morgan's bedroom for the sleepover. The walls were plastered with typical adolescent decor, creating a grotesque contrast to the lethal logistics being negotiated on the floorboards. They laid out their sleeping bags, eventually piling into the same bed. As the house went quiet and the digital clock on the nightstand pushed past midnight, the tension in the room thickened. Anissa stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the signal. Morgan possessed a 5-inch carving knife, pilfered from her mother's kitchen drawers, hidden securely in her belongings. The plan dictated that they would duct tape Payton's mouth shut while she slept, plunge the blade into her neck, and pull the covers over the resulting trauma to buy themselves time for their escape. But as the hour approached, the resolve in the room fractured. Morgan found herself paralyzed by an unexpected wave of hesitation and physical exhaustion. She later communicated to investigators that she simply felt too tired to carry out the intense physical exertion required for murder at that hour. The logistical reality of massive blood loss on her own bedsheets also presented a terrifying hurdle. A silent agreement passed between the two conspirators in the dark. The timeline would be pushed. They closed their eyes, sleeping shoulder to shoulder with the girl they fully intended to slaughter the following day. Morning broke with an eerie domestic normalcy. The girls woke up, stretched, and were treated to fresh donuts by Morgan's mother. They sat at the kitchen counter, eating breakfast in the soft morning light. Payton smiled, entirely unaware of the lethal calculations being recalibrated just inches away from her. The conspirators were actively revising their strategy over powdered sugar and milk. The new objective was the public restroom at nearby David's Park. The logic was cold and heavily utilitarian. Public park bathrooms featured central floor drains. Blood could be washed away easily, concealing the crime scene long enough for them to begin their 300-mile trek north to the Nicollet National Forest. They packed a small, unassuming black backpack. Inside were the items they deemed necessary for surviving in the wilderness as proxies of the entity: a few granola bars, a plastic water bottle, a printed map of the Wisconsin interstate system, and the carving knife. The walk to David's Park took less than 10 minutes. The late May air was hovering around 60 degrees, already thick with Midwestern humidity and carrying the scent of cut grass and warm asphalt. Upon arriving, they directed Payton toward the cinderblock bathroom facility near the playground. The heavy steel door groaned shut behind them. The concrete walls echoed sharply with their footsteps. Once inside, Morgan slipped the knife to Anissa, subtly gesturing for her to initiate the assault. The atmosphere in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room grew instantly suffocating. But the bathroom plan disintegrated. Anissa, confronted with the immediate, visceral reality of the act, experienced a sudden surge of logistical panic. She realized the confined space offered absolutely no acoustic dampening. If Payton screamed, the high-pitched sound would bounce violently off the ceramic tiles and alert anyone walking on the adjacent paved trails outside. Anissa handed the weapon back, shaking her head. The execution was aborted for a second time. Payton remained confused by the bizarre, tense exchange between her friends, but chalked it up to their usual, unpredictable eccentricities. She trusted them. That profound, unwavering trust was the primary weapon Morgan and Anissa wielded against her. Exiting the restroom, a third and final plan was quickly formulated. Anissa pointed toward the dense, overgrown tree line at the very edge of the park. It was a wooded tract heavily shielded by thick summer foliage, far off the manicured paths. She suggested a game of hide and seek. Payton agreed immediately, eager to break the strange, heavy tension that had settled over the morning. The three girls stepped off the paved trail and pushed through the heavy underbrush. The temperature dropped noticeably in the shade of the canopy. The ambient noise of the nearby street traffic faded, replaced by the snapping of dry twigs and the rustling of damp, rotting leaves beneath their sneakers. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The canopy blocked out the morning sun, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. shadows that Morgan's fractured mind readily interpreted as the faceless entity watching from the periphery, demanding his tribute. Anissa assumed the role of the orchestrator. She instructed Payton to lie face down in the dirt and cover her eyes, counting out loud to give the others time to hide. Payton complied without a second thought, pressing her face into the damp earth. She began to count. The slow, methodical pacing of the morning shattered. Anissa stepped back, locking eyes with Morgan. She gave a sharp, urgent command, telling her to do it now. Morgan lunged. The attack was a frenzy of uncontrolled, chaotic violence. The 5-inch blade flashed in the muted light, coming down rapidly, 19 times. The strikes were indiscriminate, tearing through soft tissue and muscle with terrifying force. Payton screamed, a guttural, agonizing sound that vanished into the thick canopy above. She fought back, twisting violently in the dirt, trying to grasp the blade, her hands slipping uselessly on her own blood. Short, clipped breaths, the heavy, metallic stench of copper filling the humid air, the dull sound of tearing fabric. One thrust penetrated Payton's abdomen, piercing her stomach and liver. Another sliced deep into her arm as she raised it in a desperate defensive posture. The most lethal strike drove directly into her chest, halting a fraction of a millimeter from severing a major artery leading straight to her heart. Had it gone a microscopic distance further, the catastrophic internal bleeding would have ended her life in under 60 seconds. Morgan stepped back, the knife dripping onto the leaves, her flat effect held entirely intact. She felt no remorse, no sudden realization of horror, only the clinical satisfaction that the violent task was finally complete. Anissa, observing the carnage, experienced a brief moment of overwhelming shock, but quickly suppressed it under the weight of their shared delusion. The blood sacrifice was paid. Payton lay writhing on the forest floor, clutching her chest, gasping for air as her punctured lungs struggled to inflate. Anissa leaned down, her voice devoid of empathy, instructing the bleeding girl to stay quiet. She told her they were going to get help. It was a calculated, hollow lie designed specifically to keep the victim stationary while the attackers made their escape. Morgan and Anissa wiped their bloody hands on some broad leaves, turned their backs on their dying friend, and walked deeper into the trees. They did not look back. Silence returned to the woods, broken only by the ragged, shallow breathing of a 12-year-old girl bleeding out into the Wisconsin soil. The initial shock of the trauma began to give way to searing, blinding pain. Payton's vision blurred at the edges. The urge to close her eyes and surrender to the encroaching darkness was overwhelming. But the human body possesses a terrifying resilience when confronted with its own termination. A primal, absolute will to live ignited within her. She knew they were not coming back. She knew if she stayed in the dirt, she would die there. Ignoring the catastrophic damage to her organs, Payton forced herself onto her hands and knees. Every microscopic movement tore at the 19 lacerations mapping her body. She dragged herself forward, inch by agonizing inch, focusing only on the bright gap of sunlight filtering through the trees ahead. It was the edge of the woods, the paved path. She crawled through the mud, leaving a dark, heavy trail behind her. She pushed through the final layer of brush, collapsing onto the warm concrete of the bicycle trail. She had nothing left. She lay there, staring up at the sky, waiting for the end, or for a miracle. Greg Steinberg was navigating his usual Saturday morning bicycle route along the paved pathways bordering the local park. The air was still carrying the heavy dampness of the previous night. Up ahead, where the thick brush of the woods met the manicured concrete, he noticed a strange shape obstructing the lane. From a distance, it registered as a discarded piece of clothing, perhaps a bright jacket left behind by a careless jogger. As his tires closed the distance, the shape shifted. He slammed on his brakes, the rubber skidding against the pavement. It was a child pulling herself out of the dirt. She was completely covered in a dark, wet crimson. He dropped his bike and immediately dialed emergency services. He relayed to the dispatcher that he had found a young female in critical condition, bleeding profusely from multiple unknown lacerations. He crouched beside her, trying to offer comfort without moving her shattered frame, waiting in the agonizing quiet until the distant, rising wail of sirens finally broke the suburban calm. The medical response was aggressive. Paramedics rushed the stretcher down the paved path, their boots slipping slightly on the blood-slicked concrete. The back of the ambulance transformed into a chaotic blur of pressure bandages and oxygen masks as they raced toward the trauma center. The victim was fading rapidly, her body entering severe hypovolemic shock from the massive loss of fluid. Inside the trauma bay, the surgical team faced a horrific anatomical puzzle. They had to locate, clean, and seal 19 distinct puncture wounds scattered across her arms, legs, abdomen, and chest. The true scale of her miraculous survival became apparent only under the intense glare of the operating lights. The blade had struck major organs, including her liver and stomach, but the most lethal strike had been delivered to her chest. The steel had penetrated deep, halting a microscopic fraction of an inch away from the major artery of her heart. Had the weapon gone a hair further, or had her heart been at a different stage of its expansion cycle during the impact, she would have bled to death on the forest floor before the bicyclist ever found her. Before the anesthesia pulled her under, she exhibited a final, staggering surge of adrenaline. She managed to clearly communicate with the attending officers standing by her bedside. She provided the exact identities of the two people who had left her in the woods. The local police department pivoted instantly from a standard assault response to a high-stakes manhunt. The sheer brutality of the attack stood in stark, jarring contrast to the profile of the suspects. Detectives were dispatched to the suburban residences of the named attackers. They arrived expecting to find frightened children who had perhaps lost control of a dispute. Instead, they found empty bedrooms. The parents were completely oblivious, assuming their daughters were simply enjoying the weekend weather at a nearby playground. When the officers confirmed the girls were not in the immediate vicinity, a chilling realization settled over the command center. The suspects were actively on the run. County-wide alert was broadcast. Patrol cruisers saturated the residential grids, slowly expanding their search perimeter outward toward the major highways. Dispatch radios crackled with descriptions of two middle schoolers, casually dressed, last seen carrying a dark backpack. The cognitive dissonance inside the police vehicles was palpable. Law enforcement veterans were scanning the streets for vicious, coordinated assailants trapped within the small bodies of preteens. Miles away from the sterile urgency of the hospital, the suspects were executing the next phase of their delusional roadmap. Having successfully left the suburban borders behind, they navigated their way onto the gravel shoulder of Interstate 94. Their overarching objective remained perfectly intact in their fractured minds: a 300-mile pedestrian trek north toward the heavy timberlands to secure their promised place in the entity's mansion. The harsh physical reality of the interstate clashed violently with their dark fantasy. Semi-trucks roared past them at 70 miles per hour, kicking up violent gusts of wind, exhaust, and roadside grit. The Midwestern sun beat down on the asphalt, radiating heat upward. The girls trudged along the debris-lined shoulder, their sneakers heavy, their initial surge of adrenaline completely depleted. They were exhausted, dirty, and utterly exposed. Yet they pressed on, clutching the unassuming black backpack containing their meager supplies and the unwashed murder weapon. It took nearly 5 hours of coordinated searching to finally close the net. A sheriff's deputy patrolling the interstate corridor spotted two small figures walking dangerously close to the high-speed traffic lanes. He pulled his cruiser onto the shoulder, activating the light bar. The flashing red and blue strobe reflected off the suspects' tired, expressionless faces. They did not run. They did not attempt to hide in the nearby embankment. When the deputy approached the girls and asked them to identify themselves, they complied with a terrifying, detached calmness. There was no panic, no sudden realization of the manhunt they had triggered. The officer instructed them to step away from their bags. He took them into custody without a single moment of physical resistance. A subsequent, methodical search of their belongings on the side of the highway yielded the expected horror. Tucked inside the backpack, resting alongside a plastic water bottle and some granola bars, was the carving knife. The steel was still heavily coated in the dark, dried residue of their morning execution. The physical chase was over, but the psychological investigation into how two seemingly normal children could orchestrate such an atrocity was just about to begin. The Waukesha Police Department was equipped to handle violent offenders, seasoned gang members, and drug-related felonies. it was entirely unequipped to process 2 preteens for attempted premeditated homicide. The physical contrast inside the stark, windowless interrogation rooms was jarring. Morgan and Anissa were placed in separate, isolated chambers. They sat in heavy, reinforced plastic chairs built for full-grown adults, their feet dangling inches above the linoleum floor. They were still wearing the clothes they had selected for the morning walk to the park, standard suburban adolescent attire, now heavily dusted with dirt and heavily speckled with the dark, dried biological evidence of their morning activities. To the seasoned detectives observing through the two-way glass, the suspects looked exactly like what they were: children. The initial approach taken by law enforcement was rooted in standard investigative protocol regarding juvenile offenders. When a child commits an act of extreme, calculated violence, the primary assumption is almost always coercion. Detectives entered the rooms operating under the working theory that the girls were proxies in a very literal, real-world sense. The investigators believed a flesh-and-blood adult, most likely an older, manipulative male predator, had groomed them, exploited their psychological vulnerabilities, and explicitly ordered the hit on Payton. The interviewers spoke softly, offering sodas and employing gentle, non-threatening tones, attempting to coax a name out of the suspects. They needed to identify this dangerous mastermind and lock down his location before he vanished. The suspects were surprisingly cooperative. They eagerly spoke of the man who instructed them to carry out the blood sacrifice. Anissa described him with a chilling sincerity, detailing his unnatural height, his featureless visage, and the immaculate, sharp black suit he always wore. Morgan confirmed his existence, explaining to the officers that he watched her constantly, communicated with her telepathically, and had explicitly threatened to slaughter her entire family if she failed to secure her status as his loyal servant. The detectives furiously scribbled notes on their legal pads. For a brief, terrifying window, a localized panic rippled through the precinct. Officers began mentally cross-referencing the girl's physical description against known sex offenders, transients, and dangerous individuals residing within the county limits. They were hunting a tall, pale man in a suit who possessed an unimaginable degree of psychological control over local youths. Then, the procedural momentum hit a brick wall. When investigators pressed Morgan for the man's exact name, her response did not align with any criminal database. She calmly informed the detective that they were carrying out the orders of the Slender Man. The seasoned officers exchanged deeply confused glances. The moniker meant absolutely nothing to them. It required a quick internet search on a precinct computer to completely shatter the trajectory of the investigation. The monitor populated with crude fan art, fabricated horror stories, and digital folklore. The realization washed over the command center like a wave of ice water. There was no adult predator hiding in the woods. There was no physical mastermind to track down and arrest. The phantom they were hunting was a fictional entity born on internet message boards. Law enforcement was not tracking a man. They were fighting a meme. Understanding the motive did nothing to lessen the horror of the formal confessions that followed. Morgan's recorded interview remains one of the most unsettling pieces of documented criminal psychology in modern history. She detailed the mechanics of the stabbing with absolute clinical detachment. Her flat effect held perfectly steady, her voice devoid of inflection or tremor. She exhibited zero remorse, describing the weapon's entry into her friend's soft tissue, the same way a student might outline the steps of a mundane science experiment. She casually explained her shifting moral compass to the detective, noting that while she felt a brief, fleeting pang of regret, the logistical necessity of the sacrifice far outweighed Payton's right to breathe. Morgan's unmedicated mind had built an impenetrable perimeter around her delusion. In her reality, she was the hero, saving her own mother and father by eliminating a necessary target. In the adjacent room, Anissa's demeanor fractured in a distinctly different manner. As the adrenaline faded and the sterile, heavy reality of the police station set in, the boundaries of their dark fantasy began to aggressively recede. Anissa was left completely exposed to the catastrophic gravity of her actions. She immediately began shifting the blame, eagerly pointing to Morgan as the primary physical aggressor. She tried to minimize her role, explaining that she merely gave the command and pointed to the trees, exposing the cowardly nature of her participation. Yet simultaneously, she expressed a lingering, profound terror that the faceless entity would retaliate against her for failing to reach the national forest. Her desperate search for belonging had metastasized into a permanent, inescapable nightmare. She wept into her hands, not necessarily for the friend bleeding out in an intensive care unit, but for the sudden, crushing realization that the magical world she had traded her freedom for simply did not exist. By nightfall, the grim details breached the perimeter of the police station and flooded the local media networks. Waukesha woke up the next morning to a fundamentally altered reality. The community panic was immediate, deep, and palpable. It was not the traditional fear of a serial killer roaming the streets, but an absolute terror of an invisible contagion that had effortlessly bypassed locked doors and expensive home security systems, entering their living rooms through the Wi-Fi. Parents across the county scoured their children's tablets, frantically reviewing browsing histories, searching for any digital footprints of modern folklore. The illusion of suburban safety evaporated overnight. If two quiet, seemingly normal girls from a good neighborhood could be weaponized by a horror story to butcher their best friend in broad daylight, then no household was truly safe. The woods at the edge of David's Park were no longer just trees. They became a dark, looming reminder of the unregulated digital spaces where children wandered when the physical world stopped paying attention. The courtroom battle centered on the fundamental question of culpability. Can 12-year-olds be held responsible in adult court for the manifestations of psychosis? The defense teams argued that Morgan and Anissa were suffering from distinct, albeit interconnected, mental health crises. Psychiatric evaluations presented during the pretrial hearings confirmed Morgan's early-onset schizophrenia, illustrating a brain incapable of distinguishing between the Slender Man and physical reality. Anissa's experts identified folie à deux, arguing she had been swept into Morgan's delusion through her own desperate need for social validation. The state maintained that the girls possessed enough cognitive maturity to recognize the finality of death. After exhaustive legal maneuvering and psychiatric testimony, the outcomes diverged based on individual culpability. Morgan Geyser, diagnosed with schizophrenia, entered a plea of not guilty due to mental disease or defect. She was committed to a state psychiatric institution indefinitely. Anissa Weier, having pleaded guilty to attempted second-degree intentional homicide as a party to a crime, was found not responsible due to mental disease or defect, leading to her commitment to a state facility for 25 years. Both remain under state supervision, their futures irrevocably bound to their psychiatric status. The woods of Waukesha have long since reclaimed the site of the attack. Nature is indifferent to the horrors etched into its soil. The grass grows, the leaves cycle through the seasons, and the quiet of the park remains undisturbed. But the fracture left behind is permanent. The case serves as a grim artifact of the digital age, a testament to what happens when the fragile, unchecked boundaries of a child's imagination intersect with the boundless, unmoderated darkness of the internet. Payton Leutner lives on, carrying the physical scars of that morning as a map of her survival, a testament to an indomitable human will. Meanwhile, the faceless entity in the suit remains, not as a physical predator, but as a persistent digital virus that continues to haunt the corners of the web, forever linked to two girls who were once its most loyal and most tragic followers. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.